Occasionally, I will have somebody call the office who was involved in a very serious wreck, but they're not looking to sue a negligent driver. They're looking to sue their own car's manufacturer, and specifically because the airbags in their vehicle failed to deploy. Now, cases involving defective airbags, these aren't like our usual car wreck cases because they're not negligence cases. These airbag cases are products liability cases, and that's a very important distinction. Products liability cases are much more technical in terms of the required burden of proof. There is a heavy reliance on experts, meaning it is a much more expensive case to try. And on the whole, it's just a lot more difficult to prove a product's liability cause of action than it is a negligence cause of action. Now, these aren't impossible cases, but the attorney and client are going to want to make sure on the front end that the case has what it takes to go the distance, because these cases are a big commitment. The first thing you have to ask is which of the vehicle's airbags failed to deploy. Now, once you have that, you then have to analyze the client's specific injuries in the context of whether those injuries were caused by the result that the airbags were intended to prevent. Now, let's do an example. So most vehicles have frontal airbags, right? But despite what you might think, the designed purpose of frontal airbags is actually not to keep you from flying through the front windshield. It's not to keep the occupant in the vehicle. Now, the design purpose of frontal airbags is to prevent harmful contact between the occupant and the front occupant space components. That includes the windshield, the steering wheel, the knee bolsters, the A-pillars, all that stuff up in the front. Any contact that you make at that velocity can be very serious. They call it the second collision. And that's what the frontal airbags are intended to prevent. That's important for our analysis because let's say, for example, you have a case where the client flew through the windshield because the airbags didn't deploy. Well, that wasn't the design purpose of those frontal airbags. That is, the frontal airbags aren't designed to keep you inside the vehicle. So it wouldn't be a great case, at least not under the product's liability paradigm. On the other hand, if you had a case where, let's say, for example, the client made a very hard contact with the steering wheel, sustained a serious brain injury because the frontal airbags didn't deploy, that would be a good case, or at least would meet the first criteria. Now, if you do have a case where the client sustains an injury in a second collision with front occupant space components, the seatbelt topic is bound to come up. But let me be clear, mostly because the biomechanical science supports what I'm about to tell you. Seatbelts will not prevent contact with front occupant space components in a moderate to severe collision where there's non-deployment of a frontal airbag. This is because seatbelt assemblies include what are called load limiters. Load limiters are specifically designed to allow the seatbelt a certain amount of give, what's called payout, in an accident where the airbag is expected to deploy. Now, the reason seatbelts do this, the reason why they include load limiters, is because if the seatbelt didn't have any give, the occupant would sustain some serious internal injuries. They don't want that. So load limiters are designed to release the seatbelt once a predetermined load amount has been reached. Usually it's about 700 pounds. It's expected that the remaining amount of load, whatever's in excess of that, will be handled by the airbag. So in a case where the airbag, or I should say the frontal airbag, fails to deploy, the seatbelt isn't going to stop the occupant from making harmful contact with occupant space components. This also means that the mere existence of a second collision injury in a case where the frontal airbags fail to deploy does not necessarily prove that the occupant failed to buckle up. Remember, seatbelts have load limiters which allow a certain amount of give, a certain amount of payout. An attorney may get a defective airbag case where his client was driving a vehicle make and model that had an active airbag recall at the time of the wreck. And that attorney's first instinct may understandably be, jackpot, I can put this one on autopilot, all right. Now, that first instinct, though surely understandable, would be sadly misplaced. You see, recalls can be for any number of purposes related to airbags. But unless the specific cause of the recall includes non-deployment of the airbag, and unless that defect is in fact what caused the airbag not to deploy in the client's case, then the recall it's arguably immaterial. And I know it's painful to say what caused the airbag not to deploy in the client's case. Then the recall, it's arguably immaterial. And I know it's painful to say it doesn't seem right. An airbag recall being immaterial to a defective airbag case. I know. But like I said, these cases are hyper technical. You rarely get a slam dunk. Last thing I'll touch on. The sheer fact that an airbag didn't go off does not necessarily mean that it was defective. Okay, so a lot of us have been involved in fender benders or other minor wrecks, right? We won't even call them wrecks, we'll call them accidents. You have to remember that airbags in today's vehicles have very complex, very advanced deployment strategies, including non-deployment in moderate and even severe accidents. For example, the right front passenger side airbag is actually intentionally designed not to deploy if the front right occupant is a child or a child restraint seat. In fact, one of the more common types of defective airbag cases are cases where the airbag's suppression sensors in the front right passenger seat misidentify the front right occupant as a child when it's actually an adult. But I digress. The point is, just because an airbag didn't go off doesn't mean it's defective. In fact, in the same wreck, you can have the driver's side airbag go off when the passenger's doesn't, and vice versa. This is because, like I touched on earlier, a lot of airbag systems will not deploy if the occupant is wearing a seatbelt. Instead, it will rely on the seatbelt's pretensioner system. Anyway, I'll say it again, hyper-technical stuff. There are no slam dunks. If you're the victim of a non-deployed airbag, I don't want you to watch this video and come away from it defeated. I'm trying to prepare you for any consult that you'll have with an attorney. And I do encourage you to speak to a personal injury attorney regardless. Just be aware that any defective airbag case is going to be an expensive case to take on. So your injuries are going to have to warrant the work and the risk that goes into it.